So now we've got the body of the garment here. This is our neckline. So we have our front neck, our shoulder line around. This is the center back, and then that's just mirrored on the other side. And this is the face. This is our front facing. So that's actually going to fold back this way. But before we sew that, we obviously need to sew the collar in place. So we have our notch here in the middle, and that's the notch for our facing to fold back. And we also have another notch here. So there's the fold back one, and then there's one here. And it's that notch that we're going to use to line our collar up with. As you can see there.
It's not the edge of the collar that you put onto the notch, is it? It's where the stitch line starts.
Well, yeah, so it's like maybe 2 millimeters back, because we want that notch to match up with the stitch line, which is actually here.
Yeah.
Probably the most important thing when you're doing this is getting it even on both sides. So when you come around to the other side, make sure that your collar stops in the same position as it started on this side.
I like to pin the centre back notch of the collar to the centre back of the garment, just so that I know that has to be correct by the time I get to there.
Yeah, so you see your
just as a
notches
controlling
there.
thing, so that might be helpful for you to do that.
Let's do that for Libby.
Yeah, for
So
me.
she feels comfortable. She feels supported. So 'cause we don't want to trigger any sewing.
Obviously, my
dramas.
fingers aren't as magic as yours, in terms of holding things together.
So you just have to be careful when you're doing this, because this is all curved underneath, and your collar's quite straight. So you need to do it and that's why you've got a shoulder, or a yoke notch here as well, so that you can hold these together. And you don't have to sew from here to the centre back all in one go. So just make sure, that the raw edges are matching, and you can pull on the top collar a little bit if you find it's not matching with the seam there, the yoke seam. So we're just doing it bit by bit. So we're getting to this corner, and then now that we're at the shoulder seam, we're going to then work to our next place, which is the centre back. And I'll show you what's happened under there in a minute after I've actually sewn it. But when you get to this point, you can sort of pull that top collar out of the way to sew around the curve of the neck here. So just matching the raw edges up. We've got our pin in the back. As you come to it, you can take that pin out. Just make sure this is being held in place. Past the centre back.
And it's a 6 millimetre seam.
6 millimetre seam, exactly. So it's sort of like a foot width here. And what you could do here, like Libby was saying with her centre back pin, you could actually pin this as well, so the shoulders match. I'm just going to use my fingers, but you could put a pin in there as well. And again, like I have to pull the top collar back a little bit to match that curve.
Yeah, you won't get it in properly if you don't have the edges together. No, it just won't work.
And this, I've got my notch there. So this is going to have a little bit of stretch in it because this is cut on the bias. So again, just make sure that you've got your front collar in the right position there. You can hold that together. So around that curve. Now I'll just show you here what's happened. Because we went from sewing through the under collar to sewing through both collars here, and you can see that where I've snipped in and folded that back, I've gone from stitching through the 3 layers to stitching through the 4 layers here. So this bit can, you can pull it back, and the same on the other side. So that's free, because we need to be able to, well, you'll see in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to fold this back. I'm sure there are some clever people who can do all of this in one go, but I'm not that person. So we're going to sew our facing in place now. So sew with your first row of stitching on top, and you fold it back at that notch that you've got there. So you're on the fold of the front. And what we need to do here, you can see this here, it'd probably be pretty tempting to try and get this seam here to match up with the raw edge, but that's not what happens. It's actually, 1 centimetre. You have a 1 centimetre seam allowance on this shoulder here. So put that in place, and then you can pull this back so you're matching up the neckline. So these ones that are all sewn together or held together with a row of stitching, pull that back so it matches up with the layer underneath. And when we sew up to the shoulder here, we're just going to sew, and we're going to stop at that stitch line there. So when we lift this up, we've still got a 1 centimetre seam allowance there, and we've stopped there, and you'll see why we've done that in a minute.
Stop at the yoke.
So this is the other way. We're coming down the other side, so we're going to fold our facing back underneath with the collar in between.
So this is called bagging out. We talk about bagging out in garments a lot, and this method of sewing is bagging out the
And
facing
so,
around the neck.
yeah, exactly. So all the seam allowances are in between the layers of fabric. So I've matched this up. I've got my 1 centimetre from the finished edge down to this point here. Stitching again with the seam, with the already stitched part on top, so that'll help control the fabric underneath. Matching up our raw edges. And we're going to stitch all the way down right to the fold here. So at this point here, you can turn the collar through. It's got a little pin in there. I'm sort of just lifting that up. So that's our bagged out corner there. And what we want to do is go over to the other side, do the same thing. And then we want to match these two here.
So checking your work for mistakes as you go. Looks good.
So that matches that length there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's done. If that was wrong, if it didn't match, you just need to unpick this, and you'd need to wiggle like this back or forwards a little bit to match those lengths up. Alright, so just to finish our collar then, what we want to do, with all of our layers all facing up like this, we're going to clip in, and we're going to cut through all layers here. So we're not cutting through the seam allowance that's inside here. We clip down right near that stitch line, and you can do it from this side so you can see where that is. And I've clipped in all the way. So we have this little 1 centimetre hangy bit here, and everything else sort of just separated from that point there. And we'll do the same on the other side. So I can see where that is, where I've stopped there, where it is on this side.
It's just beside the seam.
Just right beside the seam there.
Not the actual seam.
Okay, and so now what we want to do, that we've got those, and the reason we're clipping them is because from that point down we want the seam allowances to go this way, but from that point up we want the seam allowances to go up into the collar. So you can see there, spin that around, and you can see that it just lies flat there.
You've just tucked that seam allowance under the collar.
Yep, so the neck seam allowance and this little bit end of a flap there, and you'll see if I lift that up, you can literally see where the cut edge is and how the seam goes from one way to the other. Yeah, I'm just going to sit that under there, and I'm just going to sew around to the centre back. So making sure, and what happens now is that this finished folded edge here lines up with this row of stitching. Because that's
just covers it.
Yeah, just covers it. And so I'm just using my notches here. So I've got a notch there and a notch here. So pull your collar out flat as well. You don't want it so that there's a big tuck on the inside here, because that'll just mess things up. So make sure the collar's sitting nice and flat. You're matching your points. Your folded edge here is sitting right on top of that stitch line underneath. Just going to do a back tack here.
You could press that seam allowance up into the collar if you wanted to.
It actually, it does sit pretty well.
It does go pretty well without it,
but see how you go. And then same here. So we've got this. Our seam allowances from that point down go this way, and then that little 1 centimetre flap there from the facing that goes up into the collar. And when you're doing this too, it's actually a good idea to get this so you don't end up, what you don't want is for this to pull and forget to get a tuck there. So if you hold that with your fingers, you can give the neckline a little bit of a pull as you go along to sew this last bit here. Keep an eye on, that stitched edge underneath that you're matching it up with. Whoops. So I've started stitching here. It's quite dark because there already was a row of stitching there. Back tack there, gone over to the other edge and back tack there. Now, we still then have this little flap around here. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay this flat and we're going to put a pin in here. So 1 centimetre from the finished edge to that stitch line there. Pin that in place there. The same on the other side. So this will sit. Yeah. So it'll sit 1 centimetre past that row there. Just tiny little pin. And that's to hold it in place. And the reason we want to hold that in place is we're now going to just go to the iron and we're going to give our yoke a good press, and we're going to top stitch the yoke, and by top stitching the yoke it'll help hold this in place here. So you'll see that in a minute. So I'll just press the yoke and then I'll be back.